Good morning. I'm Ann Hargraves. Roland Kuchel and I are co-chairs of the Summer Lecture Series. There are about 200 of us here in Spalding, and another 200 are remote. We have members from 3 different OSHA programs joining us remotely. We welcome members of our sister programs, Granite State Ollie in Concord, New Hampshire, UMass in Boston, University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. Just to remind you of the Q&A card procedure, those in Spalding were given an index card on entering the auditorium. Please write your questions on this card and submit them to Pam and the moderator at the break. There is also a wooden box on stage, whoops, no there isn't, for you to drop your question cards into. For those of you joining us remotely, there is a chat window. If you would like to give your name and where you are from, submit your questions there. Will, our student intern, will be writing these questions on index cards and giving them to the moderator at the break. We thank our underwriters who underwrite the whole series: Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Caldwell Law, Kendall at Hanover, the Village at White River Junction, Wells Fargo Advisors, and our sponsors for this week, Dartmouth Health and Mascoma Bank. Last week I told you about a comic book. Several of our speakers last year deplored the lack of civics education in our schools. Our first week speaker echoed it, and a local organization, the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction, has created a comic book which has sold nearly 10,000 copies in educator bundles to schools across the country. Copies of it are available at our registration desk for $5. I recommend it to you. There will be a book signing at the break. Dr. Carter will be signing books in the courtyard after her speech. New this year are debrief sessions. Steve Schema has organized debrief sessions after each lecture. There is no cost for these half-hour discussion programs. For those who have registered or are interested in attending, please meet staff member Laura Belbach outside the auditorium after the lecture. She will lead the group down to the classroom. I want now to introduce Pam Allen, who is the person on the Summer Lecture Series Committee who recruited Dr. Carter, and she will introduce Louis Greenstein, who will introduce the speaker. Pam.
Good morning. I was delighted to recruit Dr. Carter. And this morning, I'm going to introduce the introducer. I kind of changed the procedure a little bit. I'd like to introduce Louis Greenstein, who is and was an OSHA leader, and he will introduce Dr. Carter. Several years ago, I had the pleasure of attending Louis's course on African Americans, thinking about African Americans. Louis has taught at several colleges and universities, one of which was Payne College, a historically black college in Augusta, Georgia, where he was professor of history and director of institutional advancement. Please welcome Louis, who will introduce Dr. Carter. Thank you.
Good morning. I promise this will be the last introduction of the morning. And thank you, Pam, for that very kind introduction. I'm pleased to take part in the OSHA Summer Lecture Series, and especially delighted to welcome and introduce this morning's speaker. Dr. Niambi Carter grew up in Prince George's County, Maryland, a majority African-American county on the border of our nation's capital, and home to many writers, politicians, and artists of national importance. and of course, a center of the desegregation of schools movement of the last century, the middle of the last century. Dr. Carter earned her undergraduate degree at Temple University in Philadelphia and her MA and PhD in political science from Duke University. Dr. Carter is a distinguished teacher and scholar, having taught at her alma mater and Purdue before joining the faculty at Howard University, where she was associate professor in the Department of Political Science. Professor Carter has recently, just this month, accepted a position at the University of Maryland in the School of Public Policy. She is the author of American While Black, African Americans, Immigration, and the Limits of Citizenship, published by the Oxford University Press in 2019. In this groundbreaking study, Dr. Carter explores the complicated and somewhat perplexing relationship between African Americans and more recent immigrants to the United States. On the one hand, on the receiving end of white supremacy, African Americans are sympathetic to the demands for true citizenship by newer arrivals, while also perceiving them as the economic and political rivals they could be. All of this, of course, is relevant to Dr. Carter's talk this morning in an era when racial tension and white supremacy are front and center. We should not have needed the 1619 Project to show white Americans the critical role enslavement played in the rise of the United States to world domination through periods of slavery, followed by Jim Crow, de facto segregation, and what Michelle Alexander a decade ago termed the new Jim Crow, the mass incarceration of African Americans. Not only do we continue to see the appalling episodes of brutal white supremacy, but also its less physically expressed, more genteel cousin, the many forms of racial discrimination that are also profoundly harmful to individuals and to our democracy. We should all recognize, for example, that we live in a society where our schools are more segregated in 2022 than they were in 1954. Dr. Carter will lead us to a fuller understanding not only of the consequences of white supremacy in how African Americans understand and experience citizenship, but also the ways in which these attitudes and behaviors, with a deep history in our country, continue to erode our democracy. In her book, Dr. Carter quotes Malcolm X, who said, "Being here in America doesn't make you an American. Being born here in America doesn't make you an American." And so it is with great pleasure that I present to you Dr. Niambi Carter.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to Pam and everyone here who's been so gracious in inviting me and having me come speak with you all today. So, Louis gave me a beautiful introduction, and I'm really kind of at a loss with how to follow it because I think he set the bar pretty high. But I will say that much of what this talk is about today is about sort of notions of citizenship and how Black people try to assert their citizenship for their own good, and what happens when it seems that we have reached the limit of that citizenship. And in particular, thinking about immigration for Black people as a political strategy. It's something that has been talked about for a really long time. It's not strange or new, but it is something I think in this political moment, as we've seen the racial upheaval of the last few years, but certainly I think we've been marching toward this for a decade or more, about immigration again, right? And what immigration can teach us about a robust citizenship, and what freedom looks like, and what liberation looks like, and what these lessons of the 19th century can give us in this particular moment. I think, there we go. So in my book, American While Black, what I'm trying to do is talk about how African Americans understand immigration. And there had been a lot of literature in political science in particular that treated sort of Black opinion as new or novel, and certainly in some cases as either hostile or very conciliatory. This literature, in my opinion, left a lot to be desired, because it didn't really talk about how people come to find themselves in relationship to one another. So how do African Americans, right, people who've been native born, find themselves in relationship to immigrant communities? And as I started to delve a little bit more, my thought about what this meant was that, Black people's opinions about immigration, they have them, right? Most people do. If you ask people what they think about something, they can give you an opinion about it. But they're not particularly passionate about the issue, right? Like when you really looked underneath, people weren't writing letters to their congressmen. They weren't, campaigning around this issue. So then I was thinking, well, what are these opinions really about? And my argument was that really what immigration is a cipher for Black people to talk about their still impartial incorporation into the American body politic. And against the backdrop of immigration, people are able to see more clearly how far there is to go, right, to becoming a full citizen in this country, despite sort of all of the constitutional and other kinds of indications of full citizenship. So ultimately, in my text, the Black-white racial paradigm is really important, right? There have been a lot of conversations about whether Black-white racial dynamics still matter in the same way because of demographic change in the U.S., et cetera. And my argument is that if you're going to talk about Black public opinion, then yes, that racial dynamic is absolutely central to their understanding. And if we understand how Black people think about their racial group position, then we can have, I think, a more nuanced and a richer discussion about what their opinions actually are. And like I said, this grew out of my sort of displeasure with what I found a lot of the literature in the political science discipline was offering at the time. Either Black people were heavy proponents or they were opponents of immigrants and immigration. And I think it's something more in the middle, right? So part of the task, or at least the first part of the task for me, was how do we decouple sort of Blackness and Americanness, right? I think there is this idea that citizenship as an administrative construct will do something for people. But when you look at Black Americans in the U.S. for a majority of their history, citizenship hasn't really opened many doors in the truest sense, right? The franchise, which Black people didn't get full access to until 1965, and I think when we look at the demise of the Voting Rights Act to some extent under Shelby County v. Holder in 2013, that was a very short-lived experiment with full multiracial democracy. And so if Black people are not Americans in the way that we understand Americanness, then what are they left to do with their status, right? How best do they use this status? And so I like to use DuBois here because I think DuBois is bringing out or bringing up, right, that frustration with how Black people have to negotiate this thing that we call America, right? So on the one hand, Black people have citizenship. They can participate in some limited ways. Of course, Black women are not allowed to participate at the time that he's writing this. Yet there's still a sense that America betrays Black people regularly and consistently, right? So how can Black people move through this experiment unmolested, right, is sort of what DuBois is wrestling with. I mean, and there are other ideas here. But I think it's important when he's talking about this two-ness, right, what it costs, right, for ostracized communities to assert themselves. It isn't just sort of physical demands, right, where people are actively protesting. It's also emotional and mental energies that people expend on what it means to be an American. And then when you think about sort of the varying ways, right, that Black people have tried to prove their worthiness over time, even, you know, in the time that DuBois is writing, but even beyond, right? I mean, this is 1909, but, you know, this politics of respectability, where we get the proper educations and we form the right kinds of families and we promote the right kinds of values, all in an effort to be viewed as pleasing to the majority population in hopes that they will sort of bring us into the family of citizenship. But is that cost-free, right? And does it leave you worse off than before? Because white supremacy has shown itself to be opposed and certainly resistant, right, to Black efforts at inclusion. So my argument for immigration and why we, I think, should think about immigration when we're talking about a Black politics in particular is because one of the routes for immigrant incorporation in the U.S. has been anti-Blackness. And so when Black people see newcomers, regardless of where they may originate, there is a reasonable concern that whites will use immigrants against Black people, right? And use immigrants as a cudgel to scold Black people about the fact that they have not done better, right? That on most metrics of health and wellness, that they have not done better. And so I call this conflicted nativism, right? That on the one hand, right, Black people recognize that immigrants have a right to self-determination, that these people who, in many cases in this post-1965 era, right, are non-European, mostly from Asia and Latin America. And I like to talk about that next to the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, because immigration and naturalization, the changes to our immigration system are right there with these Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. But I digress. But this idea of conflicted nativism that I'm pursuing in the text is really trying to capture this idea that Black people recognize their sort of precarity in American society, their lack of value in American society, but want to balance this with some understanding of people's rights to self-determination and movement. The ability to go to another place and recreate yourself is very much a part of a Black narrative, even if it's not necessarily done in an international sense. The Great Migration, for example, right, of the movement of Blacks from the South to areas of the North and the Midwest and the West, is a very long part of Black movement in this country, Black history. And that movement wasn't just about, oh, we can leave the South. It was about where can we go and have our lives be improved? Because staying in the locations where we are is dangerous, right? And so conflicted nativists see that there might be some drawbacks to immigration, but at the same time, don't want to oppose immigration, because to oppose immigration in many cases means that you would have to align yourself with many of the same white supremacist forces that don't want to see you be a full member of the body politic. And I think one of the ways that we're seeing this presently, it's not in my book because it's just happening. I think you all have seen Governor Abbott of Texas is busing immigrants to D.C. right now because D.C. is a sanctuary city and has been since the 1980s. That was actually something done under Marion Barry. He almost gets no credit for it. But in that moment, right, where you're in a city with some crises around unhoused populations as well as poverty in many Black communities, there have been some grumblings about, well, is this sanctuary policy a good thing, right? Should D.C. actually be doing this? I don't think you will see any movement away from D.C. being a sanctuary city. It's been for so long, and we have a very vibrant Latinx community in that city. But I do think it highlights sort of Black political needs and the sort of tension, right, with the inclusion of others who may or may not be a part of the politics that you see. That said, Black nativism doesn't tend to look like white nativism. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we don't typically see Black anxieties turn into political movements or organizations. Of course, there are going to be anti-immigrant Black people, it's not to suggest that. But there is not the kind of retrenchment and retreat from notions of inclusion in the same kind of way for Black people when they are faced with newcomers as you see for whites. And this is a recent poll by Ipsos 538 that just was conducted this spring, right, around the sort of trends in nativist attitude that we see. Now, of course, you can't draw anything conclusive from this, right? These are just what people profess. But we see that in places, or when people are white, when people are in rural communities, et cetera, there is more of a tendency to become exclusionary than inclusionary. And it doesn't have to just be immigrants, right? We see this in attitudes about religion plurality. We see this in attitudes about demographic plurality. So I'm just using this as an example, but it's not the only one. And we can talk about that more if you would like. But part of what I think is happening is a sort of reconfiguration on the part of whites, at least in this particular moment, of around what it means to actually be white in the U.S. And I use Claire Jean Kim here to help draw some of this out. So Claire Jean Kim wrote this book called Bitter Fruit, and it was about how Asian Americans are racialized in this sort of Black-white paradigm. And she has these two planes of superior, inferior, and foreigner and insider. And her argument is that while Black people are considered insiders, right, they're viewed as inferior because of their cultural values, right? And we can debate whether that's true or not, right? But these ideas that Black people don't value education, that they don't have stable families, all of these kinds of notions, right? And because of that, she says that Asians are relatively valorized next to Black people, because even though Asians are viewed as, say, less American than whites and even Blacks, they're viewed as being better than Blacks because they have better cultural values. They value education, they work hard, they don't protest, right? They don't cause trouble politically, they do all the right things, and of course, whites are sitting firmly atop this schema. And I'm thinking about this in this particular moment because my book came out in 2019 and I was writing it at that particular moment. But the world changed quite a bit in the intervening years. And I had to think again about sort of what is happening. And one of the things that has, I think, started to creep into our public discourse is white racial grievance. It's not new, it's not novel, but I think the sort of tendency has become more characteristic of our current political moment. And so when we're talking about some of this, sorry, I'm just going to put this here, we see a sort of inversion of this notion where whites are viewing themselves as sort of outside of the racial map that we're used to, and seeing themselves as victims, right? That the racial order has been changed in favor of minority groups more generally, and I'm going to say Black people in particular, right? And when we saw what happened on January 6th, it really made me wonder, like, what is happening now? Right? And how are Black people processing this moment? Not because January 6th is wholly unique in the world that we live in, right? But because there are precious few moments where we see that kind of anger and vitriol move the needle on a conversation nationally. And in particular, this idea that white men in particular are aggrieved and are now experiencing anti-white bias. On the one hand, we can think of it as some notion of victimhood, but what I see it as is a way for white supremacy to reassert itself without having to resort to notions of racism, because nothing people hate more than being called racist rather than actually not being racist, right? So I'm playing on this notion of the sort of Negro problem that was talked about throughout the 19th century and talking about the sort of white racial grievance problem. And engaging in discourses of white racial grievance, I think, gives it an air of legitimacy, right? That when you hear political commentators on very popular news outlets talking about an inversion of American values, when you hear evangelical leaders talking about, Black people having the bullwhip, right? There is this idea, right, that something has changed, and that equality for racial and ethnic minorities, Black people in particular, but others also, comes at the expense of whites, right? That there is a coupling of inequality for racial and ethnic minorities with white ascendants, and that any efforts to rebalance the scales, whether politically, socially, economically, is going to cost whites something, and in particular, their group position. The odd thing is that racial and ethnic minorities don't see it that way, that in fact, their equality is separate and distinct from white experience, right? And by that I mean, they don't see any attempts to achieve equality for their group as having to cost whites anything, right? But that's not how whites generally see it. There have been numerous studies that have shown that for many whites, anti-Black bias is not only an issue that they see as a real issue, they see it as an issue that is increasing in a more precipitous fashion than, say, anti-Black bias. Again, on every metric of well-being, there is no world where whites are doing worse than Blacks, for example, or Native Americans, or other communities. On most metrics, maternal health, home ownership, wages, degrees, right? All of the things that we say make people a strong community. Yet, there is a decisive investment in this particular moment in this narrative of racial grievance, white racial grievance in particular. And we see this sort of idea creeping up in the last few years. This, again, is not in my particular work, but I think it's worthwhile, at least, to see the partisan dimensions of this, even though this is not wholly partisan, right? And I want to caution against that, because I think we often talk about these things as purely ideological or purely partisan or purely about culture or anxiety. And I think that we have to be cognizant, right, that a number of people can be invested, regardless of partisanship, regardless of ideology, et cetera, in these ideas, even if we see, say, one group saying it more than the other. And then when we look racially, we see very stark distinctions in how Black people understand this notion of anti-white bias and how white people see this notion of anti-white bias. And this is not to suggest that all white people think of it this way, but it is certainly the case that it is not considered to be out of step, right, with the prevailing moment that we're in for people to make these kinds of claims, right? So when I think about white racial grievance, right, and this is, I'm going back to my graduate school days with one of my faculty members. He used to sit in the back of the room and he would always say, well, so what, right? That's the question, so what? And the so what is white racial fears have an expectation of response, whether from state or federal or local authorities. And typically we see said response. So, for example, on January 6th, right, that was about, or at least the pretense was, election integrity. And those people that showed up on January 6th expected those members of Congress who were certifying that election to respond to their grievance. And while they didn't get what they wanted on that day, we saw in multiple states, Arizona, Georgia, and others, many of the states that were in question on that day, invoke these sort of election integrity language to start panels to look into what are essentially non-happenings, right? There is, generally speaking, no election fraud in the U.S. Yet, we have all of these efforts to ramp up election integrity. In fact, in 2016, right, part of the Republican platform was that not only do you have to show ID, but you have to show proof of citizenship, right? That was one of the things that they wanted to enforce, right, on voters. But it also is something that I care about because I think about what it looks like when white people feel aggrieved. It often looks like violence. And I know we say, well, of course not, right? America's not a violent country, but our founding is a violent founding, and we revel in it, right? Our story of coming back together through the Civil War is violence, right? And there are all of these sort of episodes of violence, and even in this moment, in the lead up to a January 6th, right? We had the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville that resulted in the death of Heather Heyer, but you had people showing up with tiki torches, saying things like, you will not replace us, right? And then on January 6th, you had people showing up in D.C. with nooses and makeshift gallows, creating makeshift guillotines, calling for the death of Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi, and eventually attacking federal law enforcement and moving into that building, destroying things, flying a Confederate flag inside the Capitol along with smearing blood and other bodily fluids, and causing the city of D.C., which is a majority Black city with a Black mayor, to be under lockdown, under a curfew, right? Because they didn't get their way. And I know we like to say, well, this is not who we are, right? That these are just slippages in the system. This is just a glitch in the matrix, right? It's a bug, not a feature. But one of the things we do know is that the United States has a very long history of white violence that is used for political means. Now, I didn't put in lynchings and all of these things, but there are a number of what they call race riots or race massacres that happened in the country throughout the 19th century into the 20th century, and these are just a few, right? That revolve around political grievance, right? We think about Wilmington, which might be one of the more famous of these events, Wilmington, North Carolina, where we saw local whites upset about Blacks asserting political power in that city decide to essentially overthrow a duly elected multiracial government in that city. And it's not just an overthrow, because it's not a quiet thing, right? We see black press burn down. We see black neighborhoods burn down. People are killed. So much so that the black population of Wilmington, North Carolina, didn't rebound, because many black people fled that city because of the violence. And so I caution us, at least, when we say that these are just, moments, that this is actually something that we do quite well in this country, right? These moments of violence are something we do quite well. And then the rest of us, right, meaning non-majority people, have to figure out, how do we navigate white hurt, quite frankly. And one of the ways that we don't talk about enough, of course we can vote, right? If you can vote, right? Depending on where you live, we see what happened in Tennessee with Nashville and the way that's been redistricted. But we've also seen it in North Carolina, Alabama, lots of places, right? But one of the options that black people left on the table, and I think is still on the table, is exit, immigration, as a way to manage white grievance. Now, fundamentally speaking, right, we think of sort of immigration for black people as part of a sort of black nationalist project, principally, right? And that's true, right? There is a strain of black nationalism that does call for separation in various forms. Some mean, just a geographic place somewhere in the U.S., some mean we actually need to leave and become an independent place. But exodus as a general idea has been something that black people have toyed with throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, and I think may be something that people consider now, right? Because if you can't be a full citizen in your home country, then what is the tie that keeps you there? In part, I think this idea of linked fate is what has kept many black people sort of located in America, right? That this notion of the race and being responsible to the race means that you have to actually be here and be in the trenches and fight with the race, right? To struggle with your people. At the same time, however, it would be, I think, short-sighted to suggest that there are no other ways, right, that people can think about being in relationship to the race, particularly now with technology, and we talk about diasporas as being global and not necessarily tied to a particular landmass. And I think at least this conversation, which is becoming, I think, more prevalent and robust online, is worth thinking about again. So when we think about so-called, kind of back to Africa movements, right, of the 19th and 20th centuries, and I'll talk about them in more depth. We often talk about them as failures. We often say that these didn't do anything. And they're failures because most of the time, black people stayed in the U.S., right? But there were black people who left, and they left for numerous and sundry reasons. And that was also powerful. Right? That was also an important moment of agency for people to assert, because when you see, and this is in part of the book, black people talking about immigration for the first time, it's usually about themselves. Right? When you see in the 1840s, black people wrestling with what to do because they are a stateless people in the very literal sense of statelessness. They are not citizens, and whether free or enslaved, don't really have a lot of formal rights, at least federally. Certainly at the state level, that can vary. But for the most part, black people are people who are unmoored from this place that they call America, this place that they want to be a citizen, right? Frederick Douglass, in fact, goes to Ireland in the 1840s as a non-citizen and is told, essentially, if something happens and you get stuck there, you're there, right? So this language of statelessness that I see invoked in that 19th century way, I think is actually really instructive in this particular moment, right? Because as we're thinking about sort of where America is going, right, where America will be, what will happen, a lot of that is predicated on what white people do. And it's not to suggest, again, that people are without agency, but the reality is white people are still the majority in this country. And when white people act politically, it tends to have these larger ripple effects on communities that aren't necessarily equal, right? And so if we're being honest, then I think exit, migration, has to be at least a part of the conversation about how do we manage as Americans, as Black people, in this political moment, when all of the things that were meant to bring us equality and bring us into the family of citizenship seem to be being taken away or rolled back. So when we think about Black migration, I think it's important to consider why. Right? Why were people thinking about leaving the U.S.? And it wasn't necessarily the allure of Africa, right? Back to Africa, I think properly understood as a metaphor, right, for more freedom. It's a way for people to imagine possibilities that they have never experienced or never seen, right? It's a way for people to get more free. Because when you look at the historical record, at least, and you look at the conversations people are having, there's not any real sense that there's any place in the world that is off limits. People just want to go where they're going to be able to have, and I mean by people, Black people, where they're going to have the best shot at living a life unmolested by sort of the capriciousness of white supremacy. So the Caribbean was a possibility, right? You have people like James Hawley go to Haiti. Africa, in particular Liberia, is a possibility, right? So you have some people go to Liberia. Canada is a possibility, and that's in fact where most Black people who leave the United States in the 19th century go. It's easy to get there, they speak English, the climate isn't so horrible that they can manage, right? They don't have to deal with tropical disease, et cetera. But then there's also Mexico. So people were pretty agnostic about where they would go. They really wanted to get to a place where they could just live. And so I would say more than the pull of some imagined place, it was really the push of America that made the move to other climes and other places a reality and a possibility for the first time. And so regardless of whether you lived in the South or the North, to quote Malcolm X, anything below Canada is the South, right? America was not necessarily open for business when it came to Black Americans, right? Even places that did not have a quote unquote slave culture, right? Did not want to see Black people in its borders. So there were a number of ways in which America just made life for Black people untenable. Because one of the primary things that happens is that people don't have any certainty that they can, if they're a free person, stay free, particularly after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. Because if you didn't have a way to demonstrate your freedom, then your status was presumed to be an enslaved person. And if that's the case, then you could find yourself either put back into enslavement or pressed into enslavement for the first time. And let's think about that for a minute. How many of us have anything on our person right now that could prove we are a citizen of the United States? And it's not a driver's license or a Social Security card. One person, two people, three people, four people, five people, maybe a passport or some papers or something that gives you legal residence status. But most of us at any given time have nothing on us to prove our status. So if you think about this in a 19th century way, that's even more frightening, particularly because just because you had manumission papers, say, or some other document to prove that you were, in fact, a free person, Nobody had to respect that. Who were you going to tell? Who was going to defend you, right? So that was very real. And then you have, just basic things. So we're talking about the denial of voting rights again, right? That's been a perennial issue for Black people in this country, quite frankly, right? We're still talking about voting rights for Black people. You're talking about the right to bear arms, which I think is very interesting, right? Because in this moment where we're seeing fewer barriers to gun ownership, and there have been upticks in Black gun ownership, that has typically scared white people into gun control, right? If we can think about the Black Panthers in California under the Reagan years, right? But the most basic right that or one of the most basic rights that we're sort of willing to defend to the death, literally, was denied to Black people. You could not bring a suit or testify against whites. So there was literally no place where one could get a hearing for any kind of grievance that they may have. You couldn't choose your marital partner, right? Of course, this depends on state and locality, but in most cases, right, miscegenation was not allowed. And I think, again, this one is very interesting because it's not until Loving v. Virginia that we see interracial marriage be allowed en masse, right? Some places like Virginia had like weird rules about if you were like a descendant of Pocahontas or something, you could marry a white person. It was very strange. But for the most part, this was not allowed until very recently. Yet you have a Supreme Court that is arguing that perhaps that right to privacy that we read into Loving is under question. And I'm talking about Clarence Thomas, right? I think it's interesting that Clarence Thomas talked about Lawrence, Obergefell, and all these other cases, but he didn't mention Loving. But Loving is the crux of all of that, right? So we could talk about that, excuse me. But those things are, I think, really important. And then the banning of letting free Black people live in the state. That happened in a number of places where Black people could not live. And if you were in the state, right, like Ohio, for example, would charge you a tax, right? Illinois still allowed indentured servitude, so that might not be a place where you want to locate yourself. So America was really pushing, right, Black people out, I would say, than Black people just wanting to be somewhere else. Black people wanted to be somewhere else where they could be free, in fact. So when we come back to, I think, this question about what to do, and what we're going to do and how to do it in this particular moment, I don't think we can get away from this sort of longer tradition of Black people thinking about space and thinking about relocation as a real possibility. So I think Marcus Garvey, most people know, started the Universal Negro Improvement Association, at one point the largest Black organization in the world, right? Because it had multiple sites, the U.S., parts of the Caribbean. But he had an idea to create a shipping company called the Black Star Line that would take Black people from the U.S. to the continent, right? He had some problematic ideas, and certainly it was the Black Star Line that ended him up in prison, thanks to J. Edgar Hoover, and then deported back to Jamaica. But it was an attempt to push Black people to think of their Blackness as being bound to other Black people, not necessarily to this place that we call the U.S. You had James Baldwin, of course, who famously goes to Paris for a number of years to write and to experience the freedom to be an artist in every way that we imagine that people can be an artist, and I think we're much better for it. You have Marianne Shad Carey, who is a free woman and whose family goes to Canada. She starts the first Black newspaper in Canada published by a woman. It's called The Provincial Freeman, and she writes a number of pamphlets to induce Black people to come to Canada. And the idea was, we're going to be close enough to the United States where we can keep an eye out on politics there, but we're far enough that we can't be enslaved, right? And she eventually comes back to the United States after the Civil War with her family, but she thought about, Canada as a real place and made her moves there. And then Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of independent Ghana, made it possible for Black people to assume citizenship in the country of Ghana, right? So that when Black people think about places they could go, right, he was thinking about this robust diaspora of Black people that he was going to create. He was partly educated in the U.S. at HBCU here, Lincoln, but he takes some of these sort of nationalist ideas, these Pan-Africanist ideas with him into the Constitution. So you do actually have an expatriate community in Ghana currently, and I think it's also worthwhile to note that this is where W.E.B. Du Bois dies, in 1968 in Ghana, not in the U.S. And I think that's important. But this language, right, of what Black people want and what Black people desire is not just with these people and is not just of yesteryear. In fact, this language here was put in the Final Call, which is the newspaper of the Nation of Islam, in 1997. This is not an endorsement of the Nation of Islam or that outlet, but I think this outlet is picking up on a thread, right, that has been there for a really long time about how do we ameliorate Black frustration? How do we actually assert the highest form of Black personhood, right? And that is, in some cases, about movement, right? Seeking citizenship elsewhere so that you can actually be a full citizen somewhere, right? So what are the arguments for and against, right? Because from time to time, we see Blexit pop up, right? I don't know if you all have seen this. I think most recently, you saw it, I think, a little bit with the election of Donald Trump, but we've seen it elsewhere, right? And it's had two kinds of meanings. So on the one hand, there were sort of Black Republicans telling other Black people to exit the Democratic Party. That didn't quite take off. And then there was also this idea of, where are we going to go, right? Where in the world would Black people go if this all goes to pot, right? And some of it was in jest, but I still think it's a part of a very serious set of conversations that Black people have been having for a really long time, right? So the arguments for and against have been made by lots of people over time and across space, some of whom were friends, right, and viewed themselves as working together in common cause. You had people like Martin Delany, like Henry Highland Garnett, who were immigrationists, who argued that moving actually would ensure that Black people could be seen as fully and levelly human, right? That you have a United States that is dead set against the idea, right, and a white population in particular, against the idea that Black people are equipped for citizenship, that Black people could be full citizens. In fact, the idea of Black people as citizens makes those people very afraid, because they were thinking about Negro domination and saying that Black people with a vote would essentially treat them the way that they treat white people, the way that white people treated Black people for hundreds of years, right? None of that came to pass. But if this is the language, then how can we actually ever prevail upon this community that we should be and that we can be free people, right? The other was that if we can go to a majority Black country, we don't actually have to suffer the indignities of American racism, right? How powerful must it be to see Black people doing everything from leading the country to working, right, to see Black faces in those places. You don't actually have to worry about your race anymore, right? That whatever might confront you, whatever might happen to you, it's not going to be because of your race. The other is that there was just no way that Black people could end enslavement on their own. That if we did not have a critical mass of white people that were also willing and also engaged in that fight, then it was all for naught. And then, of course, you had people who said, we're just tired, right? That dealing with white supremacy and the uncertainties and the vagaries and capriciousness of white supremacy is exhausting, and we just don't want to do it anymore, right? The argument against, and I will say this is the argument that seems to have won, was that Black people built the United States. So to leave would be essentially giving up their birthright, right? This was most powerfully made, I think, by Frederick Douglass when he argues that, Black people have to stay here because to capitulate and leave would essentially be giving over to white hostility, and we're not going to do that. The other, for some, is that Africa is where we descended, but we don't actually know from where. So as a continent, where would we go, right? It's not a country, it's a continent. So there's really no place there, in addition to tropical disease and other things that make people vulnerable to illness, right? That it's just not the place to go, that it's too far, right? That there's no way that we can be responsive to our brethren in the U.S. that are still enslaved if we're all the way on the continent of Africa. There were others who suggested that because Black people had sort of been shut out of citizenship, that they weren't ready for the responsibilities of colonization, right? They weren't ready to lead and participate in governments in the same kind of way. And if that was going to be an expectation, then we can't do it. The other was suspicion of forces like the American Colonization Society and others, right, who were sort of leading some of the charge for Black relocation to the continent. And there were just people who were saying, why would people who don't even view us as fully human be invested in our well-being? Right? That if we're going to go anywhere, it needs to be on our own steam, on our own dime, and we can't trust the ACS. And lastly, because of colonization, there's no place in the world that Black people can really go and be free of white supremacy. Not the Caribbean, right? Not the continent in most cases, so we might as well just stay here. And this seems to be the argument that prevailed, right? Nonetheless, I do think these moments are at least instructive, right? Because thinking about what is here and what has been and what could be, right? I think we have to consider migration as another part, another strategy, another tool in the arsenal. I mean, of course, we can vote, we can do all of those things for now, but I think that it is cold comfort to communities that have been traumatized, right? By white supremacy, if you will, and I don't mean that just to communities of color. Most people have been traumatized by white supremacy, right? That just voting is going to fix it. So I recognize I'm running low on time, but these are some concluding thoughts. And I just put this picture here because this is the view I had on Inauguration Day, on the day before Inauguration Day, on one of the roofs. This is out looking on Constitution Avenue, and that's a tank, and those are military personnel in the background. And you can't see all of the fences and stuff that were around, but that's Rayburn, the Rayburn building in the back. And one of the things that I think of in this moment is that it is not enough to say that white racial grievance is not real or it's out of step with the majority of how most Americans feel. Because most Americans don't have the ability to have their grievances acted upon with the urgency and with the seriousness that upset white men do. And I think when we're talking to communities that have been on the receiving end, right, of that violence, or who have been the sort of straw men used as reasons and rationales for that violence, it is a much less comfortable place to be, right? Particularly when you have, it seems at least, a Supreme Court that is rolling back a lot of hard-won gains and it seems dedicated to that course of action, a Congress that is unable or unwilling to support basic notions of, I think, Americanness, like one person, one vote, and to do the right thing by the most of its citizens, then it is not crazy to expect that those who are the most harmed, right, by those same inability to act, to see a way out of this space, right? And so while migration has not been the trend, I do think it's an important one to at least consider in people who might feel most agentic, right, might think of movement as a possibility. And even if we're not seeing big out migrations to other countries, to Costa Rica or to Panama or to Ghana or other places on the continent, we might actually see people moving around to different states, right, to try to find some relief and live in a place that feels like it's not as hostile to who they have been. But also, I think, and this is where I'll end, that we can rethink how we create community and how we create racial community and how we think about what makes us an us, right? And that, at least with technology and other things, that might be more of a possibility than we ever thought before. So exit as a strategy may not be as far afield as we think it is, and I think it's a part of a Black politics that we probably should take more seriously. So I'll stop here. Thank you all for your attention.
Okay, welcome back. Niambi and Louis will be out shortly, and I hope you all enjoyed your cookies and coffee or lemonade or whatever. Let's welcome our speaker and our moderator.
Welcome back. Do I need this? Do you have? Yeah, I need it. Okay. The first question, Pam Allen asked, we're aware that demographically, whites are becoming closer to a minority, and by the middle of the century will be a minority in the United States. As whites lose their majority status, what difference do you think that's going to make?
Okay, so thank you for that question, Pam. And I think this is what people are pondering in this moment, is what does this mean for us when we become a minority? Now, I don't think demographics are destiny in the sense that just because whites become a numeric minority that they lose power, right? I think the way our democracy is set up, it is very possible, right, for smaller numbers of people to exercise an outsized amount of control, right? That said, I think this is what people are fearing, because if you've lived your life being the majority and seeing yourself represented everywhere, and you're faced with the possibility of that changing, then who are you, right? What makes you you, and what makes you interesting or special? And will these people who become the majority treat you poorly, right? Is there going to be some sort of retribution or some sort of revenge, right, afoot? And I don't think that's a reasonable fear necessarily, but I understand why people would feel that way. So we don't know what's going to happen, but it certainly is the case that we can't just assume that the demographic change will therefore lead politics in a different direction.
Just to follow up on that, we certainly have the example of South Africa, Southern Africa, where for hundreds of years, a minority population exercised complete control over a majority population. Is that in any way instructive in thinking about this question?
Perhaps. I mean, I think the dynamics of South Africa are similar, certainly not the same, right? But I do think one of the things we can look at is sort of what happened after South Africa gave up apartheid. And I think there were the same sort of alarmist fears that, Black South Africans are going to enslave or in some way try to harm white South Africans in very sort of overt kinds of ways, and I don't think we've seen evidence that that's come to pass. Fears of expulsions and fears of, now I think there have been some contests over land and the redistribution of land in some places and things like that, but I don't think we've seen the sort of evidence that white South Africans have found themselves totally obliterated from the ledger that is South Africa. But it's been a challenge. But South Africa also did something we never did, which is at least truth and reconciliation. I think we can debate whether it worked, but to at least have some sort of national accounting around the horrors of apartheid and sort of what that did to the population in that country. We've never attempted anything close to that in the U.S., and I think we might want to think about that.
And of course, the fact that whites are a minority in South Africa doesn't mean they gave up economic power in South Africa, and that may also be relevant to what will happen in our own country. I'm by no means an authority on immigration, but I understand that many historians of immigration talk about a push-pull theory to understand immigration. That is, there's something that sends people away from their homes and something that attracts them to the new place. And I wonder what the relevance of this is to the question of Black emigration. And if we look back to, as you mentioned, the American Colonization Society in the early 19th century and the founding of Liberia by that organization as a potential homeland for freed enslaved people. And we think about the various times in American history when white people, including Abraham Lincoln, were eager to move African Americans out of the United States. How does this push-pull fit in with these questions?
Well, I think what Lincoln and others in the ACS were doing were trying to find a solution on the cheap, right? So the issue wasn't going to be, questioning white supremacy or the foundation of this country. It was going to be, well, let's just get rid of all the free Black people because they're disruptive. They're disruptive to the enslaved because they make them think of freedom, and they're disruptive to us because we can't incorporate them, right? Politically or otherwise. Right, this population of what they viewed as sort of semi-vagrant, angry people potentially couldn't be absorbed. And so I think about, the push-pull of it all, again, as the push is America itself, right? You erect so many barriers that people can't actually do the thing or do the things that you promise citizens can do. Now, of course, most of the time that we're talking about some of this, people weren't citizens, Black people weren't citizens. So that's sort of, part of the problem, but they think of themselves as citizens. They're actually using the language of citizenship to push right back on this idea of American exclusion. So I think it was more push than pull. I think even when you look at some of the missives that people are writing, right, about Liberia and other possibilities, these places aren't panaceas, but it's the first time for some that they experience what they imagine freedom to be. So I think in the present, if I'm understanding the question properly, the push is saying, like, we've tried this American experiment thing for a really long time, right? It's been, let's say 1865, we've been trying. And so we've been trying for over a century. Maybe it is time to just pick up stakes, right? Because there are some, and I don't say that they're the most usual of Black public opinion holders, but that America cannot be rehabilitated. It can't be fixed. And we have to either start all over or we just have to leave, right? That America can't be fixed. And I don't think that's probably the general feeling, but I think for those who sense that America is just wedded to this organization and this orientation of sort of white over everybody else and Blacks occupying the bottom, that's the push and the pull, right? Because some of these places, they're attractive, right? Cost of living is better. You get to go to a majority Black republic in some cases, or at least you're in a place where your color is not necessarily considered a deficit, but it is not where you grew up. It is not your familiar.
If you'll forgive me, I have an off-the-wall question to put to you.
Okay.
Does it make any sense at all to see the slave trade as an immigration movement with push, not much, but a lot of pull? When we talk about immigrants to the United States, we never seem to include African Americans except more recent immigrants from the Caribbean and Africa. But the several million African Americans who came to North America, let alone the rest of the Western Hemisphere, in chains, they were immigrants too, aren't they?
No, that was human trafficking. That was not voluntary.
Right, but many immigrants who've come, while not in chains and not human trafficked, were coming because conditions were so bad in their homeland that America was an attractive alternative. It's not a big point. It's just something that's...
and I see what you're saying. And listen, I don't think there are a lot of people who seek asylum or refuge because, their home country is in a great place. But certainly there's no indication that the conditions of the continent were such that people were clamoring to jump on those ships. And so I would say that I don't think of the Middle Passage in that sort of way that people get to the U.S. and Brazil and the Caribbean and other as immigration in the ways that I think of immigration. There's some voluntariness, even if on the edges. I think the playing with that narrative of enslavement and immigration also sets up, I think, a narrative of Black failure that makes me uncomfortable, right? So if enslavement is immigration, then you sort of say, well, Black people had like 100+ year head start on everybody else, and why are you all still failing? And so I am very uncomfortable at that. I would call it human trafficking and not immigration.
Paul Sprecher, who's watching on live stream, has written in his book, The Devil You Know, A Black Manifesto, Charles Blow advocates for migration within the United States, moving back to the South in order to become a majority in at least a few states. Does this seem like a viable strategy, and does it have much support in the African American community?
Yeah, I will be honest, I haven't read Blow's book in very much depth, but I will say, it's a provocative idea, but again, an idea that's sort of been around for a while. That was sort of, for some separatist nationalists, that's what they were calling for. They were calling for Blacks to be granted the land of the old Confederacy, so essentially the Black Belt of the South, and be declared an independent nation state. And so Blow is sort of in that same vein of calling for sort of a lesser degree of that. The only thing, I guess my concern is those places that he's signifying, Georgia, I think Louisiana, Mississippi, I don't think that they would be responsive just to sheer population. I think there would be a way to undercut that same political power. Because if you look at a state like Louisiana or a state like Mississippi, which have very large Black populations, they are underrepresented in that state despite their population. So I don't know if moving more Black people to places like that would necessarily lend itself to more Black empowerment, which I think is what he wants. You know, thinking about gubernatorial elections, mayoralties, and other kinds of things. I don't know if that's going to pay great dividends. And I also think sometimes it overlooks sort of the response of whites to sort of this influx of Black people, because I mean, we already know that people do a very poor job of estimating how many people not like them live around them. People actually overestimate. So I'd imagine that it would potentially lead to some outcomes that could not be foreseen. I think people think it's always just numbers, but it's never just numbers. And we know that congressional districts get redrawn every decade, for example. Like I said, I used Nashville in my talk earlier, and we see what's happening in Nashville. They essentially cut Nashville up, a majority Black city in the state of Tennessee, so that there won't be Black representation. And I think that kind of craftiness around how to dilute and undercut Black political power will probably happen. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. It feels too loud for me. I'm sorry. I was just saying I don't think it will actually work. Okay.
You know, it was always said that the only problem with Atlanta is that when you leave it, you're in Georgia.
That could probably be said about a lot of places.
Let me read you this question. Is the experience of the Jewish people and Israel instructive for Black possibilities?
Oh, that's a really good one. Perhaps, right? And I will say, I think part of the response to the Jewish community is because it didn't happen in America, right? World War II, it was a lot easier to say, those are the bad people over there because they did these horrible things, rather than to look at what we were doing in this country to our own servicemen and women and others who participated in World War II and World War I. But I even think the founding of Israel is interesting because, if I'm not mistaken, there was not really a lot of consideration necessarily about where Jewish people wanted to go, but we're going to make a place for you to go. So I think there's some anti-Semitism that might be wrapped into the founding of Israel. Not to say it's illegitimate, not to say it shouldn't exist, but to say, even in this sort of moment of what looks like benevolence, right, there was a concern about the character of what would be America, right, in the face of an influx of Jewish people. And let's be clear, anti-Semitism runs very deeply in America, because while I was talking in my talk about Black people, those Unite the Right folks and that you will not replace us, that is also about Jewish people and other kinds of people that they view as being dangerous to their view of what whiteness is. So I do think Israel is potentially instructive. I don't think that there's a direct corollary, because even if we think, say, like Liberia was an attempt, right, to create a homeland for this people that were being subject to all kinds of discrimination and unfair treatment, it was still in the midst of our active engagement with enslavement, and there was no, I mean, we saw what happened, right, with Liberia over time, with the settlers from the U.S. and with the natives who were already there. It didn't work. I do think what is instructive, and I do think what's really important, and that I think Black people can take from Jewish people and that is useful, is that Jewish people have been very, I think, intentional about their narrative, right? Not just about the Holocaust, but about who they are as a people and what constitutes sort of the boundaries of that community. And, you know, that narrative is very strong and very clear. And I think there's a boldness in claiming that tradition and in claiming that heritage that sometimes I think, and this is just my opinion, this is not based on anything, that Black people might be uncomfortable with. But I think that, to me, is a really instructive part of it. And I do think having these sites and these places of commemoration, not just Israel, but like Jewish museums in major cities, in important places, those are important tools of dissemination. And I think the holding on, even to the darkest parts of that legacy, are really important, because like, we will never let you forget what happened to our communities. Then that's instructive, because it could happen again, right? If you're not careful, if you're not mindful, if you're not heeding those lessons. And I think for Blacks, sometimes I think there's a great deal of, I don't want to just say shame, but in some cases shame around enslavement, around sharecropping, that does not necessarily seem to exist for Jewish people around things like the Holocaust, right? This is something that happened to a people. They didn't ask for it. This is not something they deserved. And to hold those accountable who either participated or were complicit in the destruction of that community, in the pillaging of that community, I think is something that is very admirable. And I think there are a lot of places where Blacks feel very uncomfortable about making people uncomfortable about their history and holding those same people to account. So I do think that is very instructive, but I don't know that we'll see anything like an Israel for Black people happening. For sure. I mean, this is not a conversation about whether Israel should exist or not. That is not. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And like I said, I'm not making a claim about whether Israel should exist or not, whether it's legal, whether the Palestinians are being treated well or poorly. But in terms, I think it's a fair point to be made that people were living there. These are not empty places. I think that's a fair point.
Let's turn to the whole issue of affirmative action, because we know that the Supreme Court, in its next session, will be taking up a case about coming from Harvard and the University of North Carolina about the use of affirmative action in college admissions. And so there are a lot of questions around affirmative action, and perhaps you just want to take that ball and run with it for a moment. Also, recent editorials about how affirmative action has benefited a small percentage of African Americans, but not the majority of African Americans. So I guess I'm not really formulating a question, but opening it for you.
Well, I think the affirmative action, I think we'll see that go away in this next Supreme Court session. I think affirmative action as a thought, at least, was an attempt to bring educated Blacks in particular into areas of employment and other kinds of things. I think what has happened, at least the narrative around affirmative action, is that it is only for Black people, and we know that's not true, and that Black people who benefit from an affirmative action are always underqualified. Right? I mean, that's one of the key sort of points that opponents of affirmative action always made, is like, we are not doing Black people any favors. They're unprepared for the college experience. They're less well qualified and therefore will not do well. And this is damaging to them. And that doesn't seem to be the case. And even when we look at the sort of affirmative action admissions on some of these elite campuses like Harvard, a lot of those students are actually not Black Americans, but children of immigrants. in some cases, and that's been a finding of, I guess, the last 5 years, I think, so when that came out. I think the university is going to be less rich getting rid of affirmative action, but I don't think that the end of affirmative action means that we can't be creative about how we think about things like university admissions, right? I mean, a lot of institutions, for example, under the pandemic have gotten rid of things like the GRE for graduate admissions. Some places have stopped using SATs and ACTs because they don't really measure what we think they're measuring, right? So I think we can at least use this moment to be thoughtful about what it is we're actually trying to achieve in universities and what we want when we're creating classes of students, right? I mean, I'm sure some people in here are probably from admissions, and there are lots of things you have to think about when you're creating cohorts of students. And race could be one of them, but if it's not